Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the G7 meeting that was called for by the UK, which currently chairs the G7. Regarding Afghanistan, no surprise on that. The Europeans seemingly were looking for an extension of the deadline of the complete withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, but the US has not budged. We remember the Taliban had also warned that there should not be a postponement of that final deadline of when US forces, and by default then really other forces as well, leave the country, foreign forces that is. This is very different certainly from the summit that was held in June, where a lot of these European countries seemingly had understood that the situation whenever the U.S. would withdraw would be such that the U.S. would maintain enough of a presence to keep their respective Kabul embassies safe and secure as well, and open really. And there is talk of what betrayal, those words are being thrown around, of course on the part of the Afghan people themselves, but then also then on the part of the Europeans and the other allies and countries who are members of the G7. Let's put these points now to our esteemed panelists who are joining us from around the world today. We're joined up by Professor Iain Begg, who is a professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. He's joining us today from Cambridge. Joining us from Los Angeles, California is Sara, who is a philanthropist. And joining us from New York, is Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs, who is a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Jeffrey, Sara, and Iain, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Jeffrey, I'd like to start with you. So, I was reading the communique that came out of the G7 summit, and it certainly does not mention deadline, which was, as we know, a point of contention between the U.S. and the rest of the countries. But it puts a lot of onus, on human rights, et cetera, as well. Do you think that this was sort of just like a meeting for the sake of a meeting, that nothing was really achieved here, that the Europeans are sort of feeling left out?
I think that the crucial venue right now is the UN Security Council. There's really no way, in my view, to address this issue but through the UN process. And the Security Council has the advantage, of course, that China and Russia are at the table. Those are two crucial countries to find a peaceful resolution of this crisis and a way forward for Afghanistan. So I thought the G7 at best should be seen as preparatory to the real work of the UN Security Council, which should be working with the Taliban and with others in Afghanistan to find, first of all, peace and calm, avoidance of more bloodshed, enabling expats and Afghans that desire to leave, and then to find a modus operandi for moving forward, also to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe and to avoid unilateral punitive economic measures, say, from the United States, which could just deepen the crisis further. All said, the G7's not really the decisive player in this. The UN Security Council is the decisive counterpart, in my view.
Iain, there's criticism also of Boris Johnson and him calling this meeting to begin with, that he was trying very, very hard to remain, I wouldn't say the word is relevant, I would think that'd be the incorrect word to use, but to remain involved within this process and to try to defend the UK role for the past 2 decades as well. Has he succeeded in that regard?
No, he has not succeeded in making the UK relevant. But what he's managed to do is to articulate the discontent on the European side of the G7, probably also the Canadians, at the way in which Biden has decided to make this very rapid withdrawal. It's pretty clear, if you read between the lines, that there is a deal between the Taliban and the Americans, probably reinforced by the knowledge that the CIA director was in Kabul just a couple of days ago. So what's going on is an attempt to make at least the least bad of a very bad situation for the Europeans. Now, G7 meetings have communiques, and when the communiques say nothing, they've been prepared in advance, it's because nothing novel has been agreed. But what I think will have been going on at the G7 is an attempt to think, how do we take this beyond the immediate crisis of the withdrawal of both the nationals, the Afghan supporters of the various Western countries, and the troops themselves. that's where it gets interesting.
Sara, what is your thought? What are your thoughts about the G7 with the meeting and just overall these countries' role in Afghanistan?
Being in Afghanistan myself past 11 days ago, obviously being an African American and doing my philanthropy in Afghanistan, I definitely believe that how U.S. took a part in this new chapter was completely, it was not prepared, because evacuating all these people, first of all, right now out of Afghanistan, 100,000, 300,000, 500,000. What about the remaining 38 million? Are they not a human? If we are doing our humanitarian work. So coming right back to G7 meeting, I agree with both of the professor, how everything's being conducted right now, and the fact some of the intelligence of U.S. were just there. It obviously brings a different type of attention to U.S. of why the deals or why the communication was not clear with our friends and with our allies. So Afghanistan, the situation, yes, definitely from what I see, is only going to get a little bit even worse, or maybe more, because right now our banking have sanctioned, the borders are closed, no commodity trade is happening, and I'm on a daily communication with my team that are in Afghanistan. Airports are you can't even get to the airport. So even my team, who've been working with a U.S. organization, myself as the founder, there's no way for them to get to the airport. And once they get close to the airport, the Taliban, they refuse for them to even pass on a certain border. So actually, right now, it's going to get even much more tougher for Afghanistan from where I see it.
Yeah. Jeffrey, I'll go back to a point that you made about the economic situation in Afghanistan, because that's something that's been dawning upon me as well. So if we have all these sanctions and limits on aid as well to the country, even though the United Nations has requested certainly access, which I believe so far it has not been given because of the evacuation process at Kabul airport. What then was the U.S. plan all this time? Was it sort of to just create this really bad economic situation? I mean, I don't mean to say that that was necessarily intentionally done, but because that is happening as a direct result of the way this withdrawal has been handled, certainly the U.S. has some responsibility for continuing fallout then in that regard?
There's no plan. I can assure you. This is really bollocksed up, and it's just, I've been saying for years, you cannot imagine the U.S. leading the world. My God, we can't even put one foot in front of the next in our own country right now. So this is not a reflection of any deep plan, any deep conspiracy. This is just messed up. And the United States mission in Afghanistan, if I could put it that way, over the last 20 years was ill-advised and poorly handled to begin with. We need, absolutely, in my opinion, not to try to isolate the new government, not to try to starve the country to some desperation, but that's a typical U.S. tactic in a situation like this. I don't think they've decided on anything. We really need, and I think Afghanistan, most importantly, needs a government, internal peace, not another round of civil war, and not a brutal asphyxiation financially from the outside, where the U.S. And others say, no loans, you can't have your reserves, we are going to starve the country. This would be just another round of catastrophe on a human level, another flood of refugees. It makes no sense. But I say it because it's really possible that now is coming into the U.S. thinking, well, we're out, but we don't have to give Afghanistan's reserves over. We don't have to have any new loans. And I can imagine the right wing in the United States also, well, we have to crush them. We have to punish them, maybe even fund new insurgencies. Enough after 40 years of war in this country. It's time for finding some understanding to build. And that's what I'm hoping happens. And I'm hoping that can happen through the UN Security Council. I'm hoping that China and Russia, two really major powers in the neighborhood that also don't want massive instability, will say, let's be pragmatic on finding a way forward. But also, all of this depends on the Taliban and the new powers that be not engaging in bloodshed, vengeance, crackdowns, many horrible things that could happen.
Iain, what should be the European role going forward? And because Joseph Borrell has said that what's happened in Afghanistan and the way the withdrawal was handled proves, and I'm paraphrasing his words, that the EU and Europe needs more geopolitical muscle. Can the EU exert such muscle? Can it play, I wouldn't call it a leading role, but an important role right now going forward in Afghanistan?
This is the second of your questions, to which I'm going to answer no. Joseph Borrell is, as your viewers will know, the High Representative, which is equivalent of Foreign Minister of the European Union. But the real power in foreign affairs in Europe still resides with the individual countries, particularly with France and Germany, because they are the ones who have the clout to do things. And they work alongside the UK, which sadly has now left the European Union through Brexit. They will play a role, the individual countries, but it's not going to come through the channel of the European Union. And what the individual countries will be doing will be reassessing their contributions to economic development assistance. I don't think they'll want to starve the Taliban out of existence because, let's face it, the Taliban has won. And now that they won, they're going to form some form of government. It may not be to many people's liking, but it will be the force that governs Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. And I think it's maybe time to forget external intervention in Afghanistan and allow it to play out in its own terms. And I have to say that I'm rather skeptical about Jeff's references to the UN Security Council. There's not many problems that get solved by the UN Security Council.
Yeah, Sara, on that point that Iain there was making, is it even smart for any country around the world, especially Western country, if I may pick on them for a moment, to even be involved at this point? Because, as critics would say, and you can tell me if they're right or wrong, that, it's been that involvement, Western involvement, that has created this mess to begin with. So maybe it's time to step back and let Afghans decide what happens.
Like I said, me being myself an Afghan American, myself being in country, if we don't build our own country, my upbringing is here in U.S. My education is here in U.S. I flee the country when I was 3 years old because of exact same situation that's happening today. So through my nonprofit, World Orphanage Foundation, which is worldorphanage.org, I managed to go back and I start a life in Afghanistan. And over the years of understanding my people, studying my people, and understanding the infrastructure, how everything works in Afghanistan, only Afghans can build themselves. Only we can build ourselves. A lot of different nations, they come, even for myself, having a team in Afghanistan, just educating them, because I've been focusing on human rights, foreign policy, internship program, basically teaching them how to work based on international standard, and to educate my my country and the next generation. Is not an easy job, gentlemen. It's not an easy job, because I've spent 1 year being in ground in Afghanistan and I see where the issues are. I understand actually why different nations, when they bring their NGO for funding, why they prefer to work with someone who have knowledge of work ethics, international work ethics, because it's quite different.
Yeah. And
for international to back out of Afghanistan, it would not be human. It's not a humanitarian job to leave the country the way it is right now. I request actually from every nation to please don't close your doors, bring aid, just like you guys had everyone that had their base in Afghanistan, and giving different contracts to human rights, women organization, infrastructure, agriculture, just development. That's what my organization was doing, which was internship and focusing on orphans. I tried for past 9 years, speaking very directly to the government of Afghanistan, to Ministry of Education, and every single ministry that was in Afghanistan, they know of me very well, that allow adoption. Because World Orphanage Foundation, my focus was the orphan kids. How many more orphan kids are we creating today? A whole lot more.
Sara, I'm gonna come in just unfortunately the clock is getting the best of us. I do sincerely apologize. Jeffrey, I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. What then do you think are the lessons that have been learned here? Or have there been any lessons learned here? In fact, let me put it that way, because many people are saying this is a huge stain on Biden. This was not on many people's part the expectation from what Biden would do. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the mistakes of the U.S. go back to 1979 when the CIA first supported the Mujahideen. They go to 2001 with the invasion. A militarized covert operation approach destabilizes other countries. It doesn't solve social, economic, and political problems. Now we face a very difficult reality. I want to agree with Professor Begg that the UN Security Council traditionally is not the place where many things get solved, but it's the place where things really should be solved. The problem is the United States doesn't like to cooperate with China and Russia, but I'll say in this circumstance, cooperation for the good of stabilizing Afghanistan, preventing another humanitarian disaster, and getting on with the peace is crucial. So while he's completely correct that it's against the odds, I think that it is extremely important.
Very well. We're going to leave there at that. I really appreciate Jeffrey Sachs, Sara Kazimi, and Iain Begg for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to speak to us today and to share their expertise with us on the G7 summit that was taking place, the emergency summit, if we may call it that, on Afghanistan. The EU countries, or including the UK then, as a European country as well, wanted an extension of the deadline, the withdrawal deadline of the United States, but that has not come. The communique is quite a general one. As one of our panelists said, it probably was written, in fact, in advance of the summit, because it doesn't really seem to have much crux to the matter. What does this then mean for the Europeans going forward in Afghanistan? What does this mean most importantly, as Sara kept discussing, the Afghan people, who must always really be at the center of these discussions, because who really is actually advocating for the Afghan people who are left behind? So it's not just about continuing to talk about evacuation. It's also about, hey, who is then going to talk about those people left behind and what kind of lives they're going to lead, their security, their safety, their education, their human rights. That's really, really key to discuss. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the second segment of today's show, we're going to be discussing Iran, and we're going to take a different angle on Iran and its regional as well as extra-regional diplomacy. And we're going to discuss if or if not Iran uses fuel exports to certain countries to possibly increase its influence or to ensure that it's helping out its allies. So we know that Iran, for example, has now resumed, I should say, exports of fuel to Afghanistan, and that was at the request of the Taliban. Iran has also sent fuel to Lebanon, even though there is some discrepancy about whether or not that fuel has already left Iran or not at this point in time. There is controversy about that within Lebanon, certainly, on the part of those especially who are anti-Hezbollah in that country. And then, of course, we know the controversy about the fuel shipments to Venezuela, one of whom at least was then seized by the United States. Is this a new form, or maybe it's not a new form, maybe it's an old form of Iranian diplomacy within the region, as I said, extra-regional as well? And is this effective? Does this help Iran continue to support its allies around the world, both regional and otherwise? Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Neda, who is a postdoctoral assistant professor at Rutgers University. She's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us today from Beirut, Lebanon, is Karim Sharara, who is a PhD student at the University of Tehran. And joining us from Long Beach, California, is Dr. Reza Yeganeshakib, who is a lecturer of the History Department at California State University. Reza, Karim, and Neda, thank you to all three of you for taking our time out to join us today. Karim, let me start with you. So let's start with Lebanon. There is controversy within the country, of course, about Iran sending fuel to the country, especially because, as I said, there are significant enough voices in Lebanon that are critical of Hezbollah. What are your thoughts on the shipment of fuel to Lebanon on the part of Iran? What does this do for its influence in the country?
Well, if I have to say, the situation in Lebanon is already very split, either along sectarian lines or along party lines. You have basically pro-US actors and pro-Iran actors in Lebanon. And look, the situation in Lebanon is somewhat convoluted because you have certain actors who are pro-US, and not only, it's not only pro-US actors, but look, the Lebanese system in itself is very corrupt. It's built on corruption. It's built on the importance of the banking system.
All right, we seem to have lost our connection. Karim, we'll try to get him back on. I know that the connection in Beirut is possibly problematic, but let me go to you, Reza, then with the same question essentially, but just if I may expand it to then Afghanistan as well. What is the game plan when it comes to Afghanistan also? Is it just that Iran wants to see stability? I mean, this is me presuming certainly, but I wanted to get your understanding of what the logic is to resume fuel exports at the request of the Taliban. And of course, I want to get your thoughts about the fuel export to Lebanon as well.
First, thanks for having me. About the new export from Iran to Afghanistan, I have to say that, of course, Afghanistan is going through a dramatic change. Taliban now is in power. They are the de facto, basically, rulers of Afghanistan, no matter what's going to be the situation in the near future in terms of incorporating the other sections and actors in the Afghani political system. They are basically the reality of Afghanistan. Tehran realized this, and they accepted basically Taliban apparently as the new rulers of the country. And of course, the Iran and Afghanistan, they share very large borders. Taliban already guaranteed the inflow and outflow of the goods and trade freely from Iran and to Iran from Afghanistan, with Afghanistan basically. And on the other hand, of course, fuel is something else. Afghanistan already basically started importing fuels from the northern neighbors, Turkmenistan, especially Turkmenistan. But Iran is, of course, trying to basically set itself as an active basically player in the political arena in Afghanistan, especially when it comes to the security of energy for Taliban. So it's basically expanding the influence and asserting itself as perhaps the strongest and the biggest player inside the political arena of new Afghanistan.
And this leads me into my next question about what then happens in the region now that the United States, as many will say, has left the region or has slowly walked away from the region, or quickly, depending on how you look at it, that there's many fears, I think, in Washington about Iran filling, quote unquote, a vacuum. Is that what is happening?
Well, I wouldn't say that exactly, because, again, the Taliban is quite strong. It has taken control over the vast majority of Afghanistan, even though we have reports of different tribal leaders and chieftains and parts who plan on raising a resistance. For the foreseeable future, the Taliban will be in charge. And so, and particularly because they're militarily strong, what needs to be emphasized is that Iran is sort of a believer in whatever the military reality is, that is the political reality, right? And so whatever is on the ground and happening will determine your diplomatic and economic and political agenda. And so here, Iran, because it has an excellent ground game that I've talked about for years, knew and planned in advance for the fact that the Taliban would be coming in, despite the fact that Iran and the Taliban have had hostile, almost going to war relations over the past 2 decades. This is the pragmatic side that we're seeing to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that they are, in fact, it's not going to be filling a vacuum, but more that they will have strong, possibly very strong bilateral ties. And so it's not only about the Iranian economy, but also, as you've been talking about in your guest as well, stability. Does it mean that they're going to be filling the vacuum by themselves? Absolutely not. You have Tajikistan. The big player that everyone keeps talking about is China. People don't seem to be able to make up their mind if it's overblown or not. We're talking about $1 trillion already in mineral investments. So to say that Iran will be the sole filler of this vacuum left by the U.S. is a misnomer, as is any sort of attempt to say that ideologically that Iran and the Taliban are aligned. This is also an overreach.
Karim, let me bring you back in, and of course you can pick off where you left off before we got cut off from you, but I also wanted to add this on, Lebanon is very different from Afghanistan, as our guests have pointed out as well, but then what is the Iranian game plan there? Is it to maintain its influence? Is it to support Hezbollah? Or is this just being done as a kind gesture?
Look, for all intents and purposes, here in Lebanon, what you have is a failing political system, the failure of which has internal and external factors. The internal factors are basically the huge amounts of corruption that you have, the systemic corruption that plagues Lebanon. The external factors are the unofficial embargo the United States is running on our country. As you can see, we don't have any electricity. A lot of places in Lebanon have 1 or 2 hours of electricity. Hospitals are running out of medicine. They can't perform operations because there's no anesthetic. Our country is basically failing, and any attempts to bring in help from the outside are immediately vetoed from the United States. You can check the statements of U.S. Ambassador Shia on this regarding this issue, and David Schinker's statements that go a long way to say. You can just contrast their statements with what before and after Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah's latest speech, or the one before that on the day of Ashura, when just as he stated that the Iranian ship will be leaving the Bandar Abbas ports within a few hours, suddenly there's an alleviation of the situation in Lebanon. Gas stations or huge fuel monsters or oil monsters operating in Lebanon, who were about to close their branches, suddenly have fuel, suddenly have oil to give to the people. There's an alleviation of the situation in terms of electricity. Granted, it's not perfect. After all, we don't have electricity, but it's still better than what we had before. Now, as for Iran's game plan in the region, look, you have a failing country. People are. Look, we don't have any social security here anymore. People are being mugged. People are being killed. People are dying for all intents and purposes. So when the United States is playing such a game in Lebanon, of course, the only thing you can do is rush to the aid of the people in any way, shape, or form. Hezbollah, not to go too much into too many details, but they have tried to deal with this internally, but they've been met with a lot of they've only had obstacles shoved in front of them. As you know, there's been the Iraqi initiative which even though the Iraqis said we're going to send you 1 million tons of oil to Lebanon so that you can we can alleviate your situation. On our side in Lebanon, there's been no work done in order to receive this shipment. So you're going basically to have to force the U.S.'s hand into accepting the status quo, which is that oil will be brought into Lebanon. The situation will be alleviated, and we're going to have to break this embargo, just as it did with Venezuela, just as it did with Syria. Lebanon it shouldn't be any different. Yes, Iran.
Let me come in, Karim, because I wanted to bring Reza back into the conversation. Reza, then on that point then of what is to then happen in the region going forward, what kind of a role do you think Iran will continue to play or will now play? Because there's talk about rapprochement behind the scenes between even countries in the region that have disagreed with Iran in the past. I'm speaking specifically about the Saudis. I don't want to get into details about the disagreements, but I think I'm trying to get to the factor that, do you think that with the U.S. walking away, so to speak, that this might actually be a good thing, that Iran will be more part of regional affairs, more accepted in the region?
Well, that's a very delicate question. The reality is that Iran will pursue, I believe, this policy of increasing the regional and extra-regional influence, as Iran previously actually sent shipments of fuel to Venezuela, which is on the other side of planet Earth. So therefore, Iran will pursue to basically expand the influence. However, there is another dimension to that, which is Iran wants to assert itself as an active player rather than a passive player, which does not basically lost the agency in the equations in the Middle East and in the world by sending these shipments. And the other angle of that is not only Iran will be an active player in the region, but also there is an establishment of the parallel economic system. One economic system is the traditional global economic system under an influence of the United States and the US dollar. Another one is the basic economic system consisted of the countries which are under the sanctions from the United States. Lebanon is one case, Venezuela was another case. Afghanistan, in some point, especially Taliban, of course, they have been recognized as a terrorist organization, and they might basically be under U.S. sanctions. No matter what, this is another aspect that Iran wants to show to the world, that there is basically a sort of parallel free world, which means it's free from the domination of the United States. Saudi Arabia may, of course, wants to influence Taliban. They have religious connection with each other, and they have a lot of money. But China is another actor. China, I think that also they're spending billions of dollars. In the agreement in 2016, they accepted to invest $164 billion, connecting even Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan with the railroad, 575 kilometers. But what they don't have is the influence of Iran and the fuel and the energy that Iran can transport. As much as Taliban is a reality, the influence of Iran is also a reality. Some countries, such as Saudi Arabia with Iran, it's highly probable that they accept a new reality. United States as well, because United States is not passive. They left in terms of the military, basically, and the troops that they have in Afghanistan. But the United States will continue this policy of remote control and exerting this basically policy of fulfilling your wishes through your proxies and allies which are in Afghanistan.
Okay, so Nadeem, I'm going to give you time just for final comments. Neda, I'll go to you first. The Israeli Prime Minister is, I believe, already in the United States as we're talking right now. He is set to meet Biden soon, and he has an Iran plan. And the reason I bring him up is that I would think that with this sort of fuel diplomacy within the region, that Israel is possibly worried about the increasing influence. If that's what this is, arguably, will it then create obstacles? What kind of obstacles will it create, in your opinion?
Well, this particular Prime Minister of Israel is even more hawkish than the last one. And so we should see some additional actions being taken, subterfuge. And the fact that he's probably coming to D.C. to try and get the Biden administration to greenlight and assist in some of those operations. Clearly, the Biden administration, while it has been slow in tackling these numerous foreign policy issues, I don't think is going to agree to that, despite the proximity of the administrations and President Biden's relationship with Israel, it doesn't want to make matters worse at this point. So I think that there will be some affirmations about the relationship and the position against Iran. I think the Iranians and the larger sort of Middle East should be prepared for some Israeli operations that will be targeting Iran. So those shipments, as well as additional tankers, carriers, supplies going into Afghanistan, these are all open to these Israeli actions.
I'm glad Neda brought up that what we could call tanker wars, right, where there have been seemingly tit-for-tat attacks on tankers and ships within the region, in waters around the region. Sitting from your vantage point in Lebanon, how important will the Israel factor then be going forward?
Look, I think that there's a key point that has been brought up by Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and it's that the coming tankers, the tankers that are coming from Iran to Lebanon, they're not just Iranian ships anymore. They're Lebanese territory as far as Hezbollah is concerned. So I think that this was a very good key term because the Israelis are very wary of infringing on Lebanese sovereignty or on striking Lebanese territory, because they know that Hezbollah will reply and will reply swiftly. This isn't something that can just wait. This is something that's been established through the equations that Hezbollah has set before Israel. And so if the Israelis or the Americans think about targeting these ships, then we're not just talking about a reply from Iran, we're talking about a reply from Hezbollah. So this isn't just a matter of tit for tat. You're seeing the evolution of the axis of resistance into increasing unity or even a higher level of integration. You're seeing a higher level of integration between the axis of resistance on the one hand and a decline in U.S. presence or U.S. direct presence in the region. So we're going to have to see what the Israelis are going to do, if they're going to do anything, or if they can do anything.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate all three of our guests for the context and the expertise they've brought to this discussion. Neda was speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Karim was speaking to us from the Lebanese capital, and Reza was speaking to us from Long Beach, California. We were discussing there Iran's fuel diplomacy, right? So it's begun exports to Afghanistan at the request of the Taliban. It's sending shipments, possibly, of fuel, plural, according to some officials, if we've understood that, maybe plural, very soon. Is that to support Hezbollah simply, or is it to support Lebanon, which is going through a genuine crisis, which no one is, unaware of, at least over the past few years or so. And then Venezuela as well in the past was controversial. Iran certainly allied with the Venezuelan government ideologically and politically and geopolitically, in fact. So there is much that unites them. What about the Iranian role in the region? Now that the U.S. role is waning to an extent, the Israeli role, though, is not waning. So how much of a factor will that also be going forward? These are already really important questions to wait and see how these things will develop in the coming days, months, and possibly even years. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.